a former Delta Force operative, wrongfully imprisoned, fights to uncover the truth behind his conviction. In a world where survival is key, can he bring down those who betrayed him? The Montana State Penitentiary yard was a bleak slab of concrete wrapped in razor wire and silence. Gray clouds sagged low, promising snow, but no one looked up. The inmates kept their heads down and their thoughts buried deeper. Except one. Miles Carter sat alone at the far end of the yard, his back against a cracked concrete wall, eyes scanning the distance like a man used to watching for threats. He was a shadow in motion, even when still, unassuming, quiet, invisible to most, but not to everyone. A group of inmates across the yard took notice. Their leader, a bulky man with a burn scar curling down the left side of his face, leaned in and spat a name with mockery. "New guy thinks he's better than us," he muttered. His name was Red Thornley, a man who ruled this place not with respect, but with fear. "He don't talk, don't flinch. What do you think, boys?" Time to break the silence. The others chuckled low and cruel. To them, Miles was just another fresh piece of meat, an easy mark, alone, soft, but they didn't know who he used to be. Miles Carter had once commanded one of the deadliest special ops units the Army ever built, Delta Force, Tier 1. He ghosted into countries where diplomats didn't exist and made choices men never spoke of again. His hands had taken lives. Quietly, precisely, always with purpose. But now, he was inmate number 71153, stripped of rank and reputation, framed for a crime he didn't commit. No weapons, no mission, just concrete, iron bars, and time. Still, instinct didn't die in prison. It got sharper. He could feel the gang's attention on him like a knife to the neck. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his pulse slowed instead of rising. They thought he was weak. That was their first mistake. What they didn't realize was they weren't hunting a victim. They were poking a ghost. And ghosts don't die easy. The visitation room at Montana State Penitentiary was cold, not from temperature, but from design. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing the pale walls in a sterile glow. Plexiglass divided inmates from visitors, a barrier that felt more psychological than physical. Miles Carter sat down, his shoulders hunched slightly, hands cuffed in front of him. Across the glass sat Jessica Hale, her brown hair pulled into a tight bun, dark-rimmed glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. 32 years old, sharp as broken glass, and the only person who still believed he didn't belong in this place. She leaned forward, eyes searching his face. "You look tired," she said softly. Miles didn't answer right away. His face was leaner than when she'd last seen him, jaw tighter, eyes sunken with weeks of poor sleep and constant threat. He looked like a man walking through fire but refusing to scream. "I'm holding together," he said, voice low and raw. Jessica gave a weak smile. "You've always been better at surviving than admitting when you're breaking." That made him look away. She wasn't wrong. "I talked to the lawyer," she continued, tapping a notepad beside her. "There's a lead. Someone scrubbed surveillance footage from the bar the night everything happened. That's not normal. That's intentional." Miles stared at her, the muscles in his jaw tensing. "So someone wanted me out of the way." Jessica nodded slowly. "Someone with access. And power." He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "I need to know who. I need to know why. If I die in here without answers." "You won't," she cut in, firm. "I won't let that happen. I'm not giving up." He swallowed hard. His eyes flickered, gratitude, pain, fear. "You're the only one still fighting," he murmured. She pressed her palm to the glass. "Then that's all we need." A guard knocked on the doorframe. "Time's up." Miles stood slowly, but before he turned, he met her eyes one last time. "Promise me, Jess. No matter what, find the truth." Jessica's voice was quiet but certain. "I swear I will." The prison yard was a bleak patch of cracked concrete and rust-stained weights, hemmed in by chain-link fences topped with concertina wire. Inmates milled around like restless animals, some lifting, some pacing, others just waiting for something to happen. Miles Carter stood near the edge, hands tucked into his gray jumpsuit pockets, eyes scanning the yard without looking like he was. It was a skill, seeing everything while pretending to see nothing, a habit drilled into him from years in Delta Force. But even now, the threat hung heavy. Blaze Red Daniels, self-proclaimed king of Block D, strutted across the yard like he owned the place. Early 40s, Jack with prison muscle, face scarred from 100 fights. His crew followed, 6 deep, tattoos crawling up their necks like vines on a rusted gate. "Yo, soldier boy," Blaze called out, loud enough to turn heads. "You still think you're special in here?" Miles didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, his body still. Blaze grinned. "We saw the way you handled Trey. Slick move. But that was one guy. You ain't got that kind of luck twice." The others laughed, circling. One kicked a basketball off the court toward Miles. It bounced once and hit his leg. "Come on, Carter," Blaze taunted. "You were a killer out there. What happened? You forget how to fight once the uniform came off." Still, Miles didn't flinch. That annoyed Blaze. "You know what I think?" Blaze said, stepping closer. "I think you're just another vet who got used up and thrown out. And now you're in my world." Miles finally raised his eyes. Calm, cold, dangerous. "You got it twisted," he said, voice low. "This isn't your world. It's just your turn." Before Blaze could blink, Miles moved. He grabbed the basketball, hurled it off the wall hard, sending dust and noise flying. The distraction gave him the second he needed. He stepped into Blaze's space, fast as lightning. "Back off," he said, low enough only Blaze could hear. "Or next time, it won't be a ball flying your way." Blaze blinked, stunned by the speed, the audacity. His crew stepped forward, but Blaze held up a hand, smiling with gritted teeth. "Okay, Carter," he said. "Game on." Miles turned, walked away slowly, each step deliberate. But the yard was watching now, and the war had just begun. The dull hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as steam curled up from the old shower heads like ghosts rising from the floor. Water echoed off the tiles in rhythmic splashes. Miles Carter stood alone under the middle spigot, his eyes closed, letting the lukewarm water run over his bruised body. He could feel it. Something was off. The air was too still, too quiet. Then came the sound, soft but distinct, the squeak of rubber soles on wet tile. Not one pair. Multiple. Miles didn't turn. He reached slowly for the rag on the small soap shelf, twisting it in his hands. Inside the folds, he'd tucked a toothbrush with a sharpened plastic handle. Primitive, but lethal in the right hands. "Hey, soldier boy," a voice drawled from the mist. "You forgot to check your 6." Miles turned, calm and deliberate. 3 figures emerged from the steam. Shirtless, scarred, their eyes lit with bloodlust. Blaze wasn't among them, but his fingerprints were all over the setup. "You boys sure you want to do this?" Miles asked, voice steady. No answer, just a lunge. The first one came fast, swinging a rusted piece of pipe. Miles ducked, caught the man's wrist, and slammed his elbow into the attacker's throat. The sound of collapsing cartilage was drowned by the rush of water. One down. The second came from behind, but Miles twisted, letting the man's momentum carry him into the wall with a sickening thud. He grabbed the man's head and drove it backward into the tile, once, twice. Blood mixed with steam. The third was smarter, or maybe just slower. He hesitated. Bad move. Miles didn't. He pounced, sweeping the man's legs and bringing him down hard. The sharpened toothbrush found its mark, pressed against a soft spot beneath the jaw. "Tell Blaze," Miles whispered, low and venomous. "You just sent boys to do a man's job." The man nodded, frozen in terror. Miles stood, dripping and calm. Around them, water continued to run. Blood swirled into the drain. And the war wasn't over. It had just turned personal. Night fell over Whetstone Penitentiary like a heavy curtain. In the dim corner of Cell Block C, Miles Carter sat at a dented metal table in the common area, his arms folded, waiting. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like a broken pulse. He wasn't alone for long. Ramon Slick Alvarez slid into the seat across from him, flanked by 2 lieutenants. Tattoos climbed his neck like vines, his eyes wary but curious. "You really roughed up Blaze's crew in the showers?" Ramon asked, voice low and laced with amusement. Miles didn't flinch. "They tried. They failed." Ramon leaned back, fingers tapping the table. "You made noise. Real noise. Blaze ain't used to looking weak, especially not in front of the guards." "I'm not here to start a war," Miles replied. "But I'm not laying down for anyone either." Ramon's smile widened. "That's the thing about this place. People respect the ones who stand up. But going toe-to-toe with Blaze? You better have a plan." Miles leaned in slightly. "I don't need a war. Just a shift. Enough to send a message." Ramon arched a brow. "A message?" Miles's voice dropped, calm and surgical. 3 of his guys go down. Quiet, but loud enough everyone knows why. Make him bleed reputation. Ramon sat silently, processing. His crew exchanged looks but said nothing. "You asking for soldiers?" Ramon asked. "I'm asking for opportunity." Miles said, "You control the kitchen run and the laundry crew. You know where Blaze's boys sleep. I just need the window. I'll handle the rest." Ramon's eyes narrowed. "And what do we get out of it?" Miles didn't blink. "Balance. Blaze gets weaker. You get stronger. And when I'm out, you get a man on the outside who doesn't forget favors." Ramon chuckled. "You talk like you're already walking free." "I'm not staying here," Miles said flatly. "And neither is this injustice." After a long pause, Ramon stood, nodding once. "You get your window. 1 shot. Don't waste it." Miles rose to his feet. "I won't." As Ramon and his men walked away, the plan was already forming. And Blaze? He'd never see it coming. The air in Cell Block C felt heavier that morning, like even the walls were holding their breath. Miles Carter knew the look of a battlefield before it broke open. It was in the stiff shoulders of the guards, the lingering stares from the inmates, the too quiet corridors. Today was the day. He'd barely touched his breakfast tray, runny eggs, stale toast, and a bruised apple, before Ramon's guy, Darnell, brushed past him near the library door. "It's done," Darnell muttered under his breath. 2 of Blaze's boys just got reassigned to janitorial. They'll be isolated in the south wing after lunch. 3rd one's in the laundry chute by 3 p.m. You'll have 5 minutes max. Miles gave the slightest nod. His hand stayed loose, his face unreadable. Lunch came, and with it, the signal. Ramon scratched the edge of his tray with a plastic fork. 3 slow drags, a silent drum roll. The yard flooded with bodies, a mix of gang colors and cold silence. Blaze strutted out last, surrounded by his loyalists, wearing his trademark crooked grin. His crew tried to act casual, but their eyes darted like nervous birds. Miles stepped into the yard, sweat prickling at the back of his neck despite the cool wind. "You're still walking?" Blaze called out across the yard. "Thought maybe you figured out you don't belong here." Miles didn't respond. He headed for the pull-up bars, each step measured, his body a coil of silent tension. As Blaze approached, flanked by 4 lieutenants, Ramon and his men drifted into position, scattered near benches, under the basketball hoop by the weight pile. The whole yard became a chessboard, and Miles was about to make his first aggressive move. When Blaze finally reached him, the taunt was ready on his tongue, but Miles struck first. A brutal elbow to the nearest thug's throat dropped him. The second got a knee to the chest that crumpled him over the bench. Ramon's guys moved fast, engaging the other 2 in a flash of fists and shouts. Blaze backed up, fury erupting across his face. "You think this changes anything?" Miles stepped forward, eyes cold. "It already has." The yard erupted. Guards scrambled. Alarms blared. But the message was sent. Blaze had been touched, and everyone saw it. The infirmary stank of iodine and bleach. Miles Carter lay on the cot, his knuckles raw and ribs wrapped tight in gauze. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like gnats. Every breath felt like chewing glass. But he didn't complain. Pain was a companion. He knew well. "Blaze's knee shattered," whispered the orderly, a skinny guy named Vince with too many tattoos and not enough common sense. They say he screamed like a kid when they moved him. Miles didn't react, just stared at the ceiling. The mission wasn't over. By the time he was cleared to return to general population, the entire prison had changed. The yard stayed quiet. Eyes followed him now, not with mockery, but with something colder. Calculation. The wolves knew one of their own had been gored. That afternoon, a folded note waited under his mattress. It read, "You drew blood. Now they want yours." He crumpled it, tucked it in his pocket. Message received. Later that night, the cell block was unusually still. No clanging dominoes. No laughter. Just whispers between cells and the low hum of something brewing. When the lights dimmed for lockdown, Miles remained seated on his cot, the edge of a shiv taped beneath the bunk just within reach. A shadow crossed the bars. Then another. "Miles!" Came a voice, low, venomous. "Time to finish what you started." The lock clicked. 3 silhouettes entered. Blaze might have been down, but the iron vultures weren't. Miles stood slow, his spine straight. "That all you brought?" he asked, voice like gravel. The first man lunged. Miles sidestepped, yanking him by the collar and slamming his head into the wall with a sickening crack. The second came at him with sharpened toothbrush, but Miles twisted his arm and snapped the elbow backward like a dry twig. The third hesitated, just long enough for Miles to bury a knee into his gut and flip him over the cot. The cell was chaos for 30 seconds, then silence. Guards stormed in seconds later. Sirens barked orders. Flashlights everywhere. Miles stood in the center, chest heaving, surrounded by bodies groaning on the floor. "Cuff him," one guard yelled. Another stared at the scene, then at Miles. He just survived an ambush. Miles didn't argue. He just turned around, wrists offered, because now they believe him. The bruises had faded, but the tension hadn't. Back in the mess hall, Miles Carter kept his tray close and his head lower, not because he feared them, but because he needed them to think he was done. Broken men don't plot revenge. Broken men survive. Only he wasn't broken. Not yet. Across the room, Ramon Vega watched him over a steaming bowl of beans and rice. The unofficial boss of Block C, Ramon had eyes in every corridor. If anyone knew how to rattle the Iron Vulture's cage without triggering an all-out war, it was him. Miles sat down across from him. Ramon raised an eyebrow. "You here to thank me for not letting your skull get cracked last week?" Miles didn't smile. "I'm here to return the favor." Ramon leaned forward, his voice a low murmur. "You want to go toe-to-toe with Blaze's crew again? They're not done with you, soldier boy. They're just regrouping." "I'm not asking you to go to war," Miles said, calm. "I just need a statement. One they won't forget." Ramon set a spoon down, the clink echoing. "You thinking shivs and fists? That's yesterday's game. We're playing chess now." Miles nodded. "Then let's flip the board." Later that night, it began. Word spread fast that a stash of contraband, cell phones, pills, smuggled blades, had turned up inside one of the Vulture's bunks. Guards swooped in like hawks. Shakedowns. Solitary. Suspicion. It was Miles' intel that had lit the match. No one knew it was him, except Ramon, and that was the point. 2 days later, in the laundry room, Miles passed a coded message to Ramon's guy. It read, "Next shipment hits the kitchen. Plan it. I'll handle the rest." By week's end, 2 more of Blaze's top lieutenants were transferred to segregation. The balance was shifting. Back in his cell, Miles sat on his cot, running a hand over the dog tags he'd recovered. One piece at a time, the empire that framed him was starting to crack. Jessica's voice echoed from a memory. "You're not just fighting for survival. You're fighting for the truth." And now, truth was bleeding through. The air in the warehouse office was thick with silence. Miles Carter stood motionless in the shadows, his eyes fixed on a man behind the desk. Elliot Foster, the puppet master, the man who had turned his life into a living hell. No prison bars here, just mahogany walls, a decanter of aged whiskey, and smugness thick enough to choke on. Foster didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "So this is it? You break out of your cage just to come begging for answers?" Miles didn't blink. No, I came to make sure you knew I wasn't dead. Foster chuckled. You were supposed to be. That was the deal. Miles stepped forward, slow and controlled. Why? Why me? Foster poured himself a drink, unbothered. Because you knew too much. Because you were loyal to the mission, to the truth, and that made you dangerous. People like you don't stay bought. So we did what we always do, erase the threat. Miles clenched his jaw, the memory of solitary confinement still fresh in his muscles, but his voice remained level. You built your empire on blood and betrayal, and now it's cracking. Foster's expression faltered for a split second. Miles reached into his pocket, pulled out the small recorder he'd hidden earlier, and pressed stop. You confessed, he said. Every word. The office door burst open. Jessica stepped in, flanked by 2 federal agents. Elliot Foster, you're under arrest. Foster stood, rage blooming in his face. You think this changes anything? I've got people, judges, senators. They're next, Jessica replied calmly. As the cuffs clicked shut, Miles didn't feel triumph, just clarity. Later, outside in the cool night air, Jessica asked, How do you feel? Miles looked up at the stars. It's not about revenge. It never was. It's about reminding myself, that even when the system breaks you, you still have a choice. She nodded, and you chose to rise. He smiled just slightly. That's the lesson, isn't it? We don't fight because we're unbroken. We fight because we refuse to stay broken. The wind off the Hudson was sharp, but Miles Carter didn't flinch. He stood near the edge of the pier in Brooklyn, the city lights flickering like distant memories behind him. In his hand, he held the dog tags he once thought he'd die wearing in a cage. Now, they were a reminder that survival meant more than breathing. Jessica joined him, a coffee in each hand. Still can't sleep, huh? He took the cup with a nod. Not really. Sleep comes harder after you learn how easily the world forgets you. Jessica leaned on the railing beside him, but they didn't forget. You came back. You proved the truth. Miles stared out at the dark water. I proved what they did to me, but I still lost years. Time with my mother, my team, my own mind. You don't get that back. You get to choose what comes next, she said softly. That's something. Miles took a sip, the warmth grounding him. I used to think justice was about punishment. Now I think it's about accountability. For them, and for me. I had to fight, not just to get out, but to remember who I am. Jessica smiled. So what's next, soldier? He let the wind carry the silence for a moment. I'm not going back to war. But I'm not sitting still either. I've been talking to a few vets, guys inside who got framed, chewed up by the system. They don't need a hero. They need someone who's been through hell and still showed up the next day. Jessica nodded, pride swelling in her eyes. You'd be good at that. Miles looked at her and gave the faintest smile. Maybe that's the real win. Not the court case. Not Foster in cuffs. Just being whole enough to help someone else get there. They stood in silence, side by side, 2 warriors in their own right. The city buzzed behind them, the future wide open. Miles closed his eyes and whispered to wind. Survival was just the beginning. Now I build.